I begin where modern American statecraft, with Iran, began to curdle. The Islamic Revolution's insistence that it was not merely a change of regime, but a rebuke to an entire Western posture toward modernity. When militants seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran on November 4, 1979, and held American personnel for 444 days until January 20, 1981, it was not only a diplomatic rupture, it was a tutorial in how symbolism can become strategy. The new Islamic Republic learned that humiliating a superpower could consolidate a revolution at home. The United States learned less quickly that indignation is not a policy. Through the 1980s, Washington's posture oscillated between punitive instincts and regional anxieties. The Iran-Iraq War turned the Persian Gulf into an arena where miscalculation could be lethal and accidental tragedy could become a permanent grievance. The United States escorted reflagged Kuwaiti tankers in 1987-88, and the naval clashes of that period culminated in the downing of Iran Air Flight 655 on July 3, 1988, killing 290 people in an event. Iran still treats as an emblem of American arrogance, and Americans tend to file under the untidy category of fog of war. The lesson, which republics resist, is that military force does not remain neatly inside the intentions that summoned it. In the 1990s, sanctions became the principal language of American disapproval, hardened by executive orders and legislation meant to constrict Iran's energy revenues and punish its regional behavior. This substituted economic coercion for diplomatic imagination, and it trained both sides in a ritual of escalation conducted through regulations and retaliation rather than negotiation. After September 11, 2001, there was a brief, easily forgotten moment when shared enmity toward the Taliban produced limited cooperation in Afghan diplomacy. But the rhetorical absolutism of the axis of evil era returned relations to moral melodrama. Since 1979, then, the pattern has been grimly consistent. Each side treats the other as proof of its own righteousness, and both turn history into a quarry from which to extract grievances. That is the past. Any new involvement must carry on its back. I call it Madison's machine because it was built to offend modern impatience. The Constitution is not, as our political romantics pretend, an instrument for the swift enactment of whatever a majority happens to feel at breakfast. It is a contrivance for slowing the republic down, compelling it to think twice, and forcing power to justify itself across institutions that do not share the same incentives. Madison's most bracing observation, ambition must be made to counteract ambition, was not a celebration of conflict, but a concession to human nature. We are not angels. Therefore, the state must not be arranged as though we were. Nowhere is this more explicit than in war powers. The legislature is given the power to declare war, while the president is made commander-in-chief. This is not a contradiction. It is a division. Congress decides whether the nation will enter sustained hostilities. The president conducts them once the nation has chosen. Madison himself described the convention's choice of declare rather than make war as a way to ensure the executive could repel sudden attacks. That narrow exception defense against immediacy has, in our era, metastasized into a habit of executive initiative followed by legislative acquiescence. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 was Congress's attempt to reclaim its constitutional dignity after the long erosion of Korea and Vietnam. It requires notification within 48 hours when U.S. forces are introduced into hostilities or imminent hostilities, and it sets a 60-day clock plus a 30-day withdrawal period absent congressional authorization. Yet the modern executive has learned to treat law as a set of suggestions, and Congress has learned that avoiding responsibility is politically safer than exercising it. The result is a republic that wages war the way it accumulates debt, by deferring the moment of explicit consent and then expressing surprise at the accumulated consequences. This is the soil in which talk of options regarding Iran grows. When constitutional friction is treated as an inconvenience, the temptation is always to substitute will for authorization and to call that efficiency. I have spent much of my professional life watching the presidency swell beyond the dimensions the framers intended, not through coup or conspiracy, but through convenience. The imperial presidency is not the product of one man's ambition so much as a bipartisan indulgence in shortcuts. Congress yields because yielding spares it the burden of decision. Presidents accept because history flatters executives who act and forgets those who pause. Thus, power migrates quietly and persistently toward the branch least designed to bear it alone. The elastic mandate is the instrument of this migration. Military authorizations, once tethered to specific enemies, theaters, and purposes, are stretched across decades and continents. The 2001 authorization for use of military force, passed in the emotional aftershock of September 11, was aimed at those responsible for that attack. Yet it has been invoked to justify operations against groups that did not exist at the time in countries never contemplated by the Congress that voted for it. What begins as necessity becomes precedent, and precedent, unchallenged, becomes habit. Presidents of both parties have discovered that the vocabulary of national security performs a useful alchemy. It converts discretion into duty. To hesitate is to appear weak. To consult Congress is to risk delay. To define objectives precisely is to invite later accountability. An elastic mandate avoids all three. It allows force to be presented as a managerial adjustment rather than a constitutional choice. The Republic, in turn, is invited to confuse motion with seriousness. In the case of Iran, this elasticity becomes perilous. Iran is not a stateless terrorist network, but a sovereign nation with a long memory, layered institutions, and regional entanglements. To treat military action against it as an extension of prior authorizations is to pretend that constitutional formality is an obstacle rather than a safeguard. It is to forget that the decision to use force is not merely strategic but moral, because it commits the nation to consequences that cannot be precision-guided away. The imperial presidency thrives on ambiguity, but republics do not. They require clarity about who decides, why, and under what authority. When mandates stretch without breaking, it is not strength we are witnessing, but neglect of limits, of history, and of the discipline that self-government demands. The Middle East is where American confidence has repeatedly gone to test itself against reality, and where reality has shown a stubborn indifference to our intentions. It is a region dense with memory, grievance, and ambition, and therefore resistant to tidy solutions imported from afar. The United States has entered this theater again and again, persuaded that limited force can produce limited effects, only to discover that in politics, especially in that region, actions travel farther than plans. Iran sits near the center of this web of consequences. It is not merely a nation-state, but a node in a network of proxies, militias, and political movements stretching from Lebanon to Yemen. American policymakers often speak of deterrence as though it were a mechanical switch, off today, on tomorrow. In practice, deterrence in the Middle East is interpretive. Signals are filtered through local histories, sectarian rivalries, and the ever-present suspicion that restraint masks weakness. A strike meant to restore credibility can just as easily invite escalation by convincing adversaries that the ceiling on American force is higher than previously assumed. We have seen this before. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was justified in part by the promise that regime change would reorder the region in America's favor. Instead, It fractured Iraqi society, strengthened Iran's influence in Baghdad, and normalized the idea that borders in the Middle East were provisional. Syria's collapse, Yemen's war, and Lebanon's paralysis are not solely American creations, but they have been shaped by a pattern of interventions that underestimated how power vacuums are filled. For Israel and the Gulf states, U.S. involvement against Iran may appear reassuring in the short term, a reaffirmation of American resolve. Yet reassurance is not the same as stability. Regional actors adjust their behavior to American presence, often taking risks they would otherwise avoid, confident that Washington will manage the fallout. This is the quiet moral hazard of hegemony. The Middle East teaches the same lesson with exhausting regularity. Consequences arrive uninvited and linger long after intentions have departed. To treat Iran as another problem to be managed by force is to forget that history in this region is not episodic but cumulative. Each intervention writes a chapter, and the next one must inherit. Force is the most dramatic instrument of statecraft, and therefore the most seductive. It promises clarity in a world of ambiguity and action in place of argument. But strategy, properly understood, is not a catalog of capabilities. It is a discipline of choice. It begins by asking not what can be done, but what should be done, and to what end. The failure to distinguish between these questions is how great powers exhaust themselves. American military power is formidable, but it is not infinite, and it is not self-justifying. Airstrikes, naval deployments, cyber operations, and covert actions are often described as options, as though they were interchangeable tools on a workbench. In reality, each carries its own logic and its own trajectory. A strike undertaken to signal resolve may demand follow-on action to preserve credibility. A limited engagement can generate demands for escalation, not because escalation was intended, but because adversaries adapt and allies recalibrate their expectations. A strategy that does not anticipate this dynamic is not a strategy at all. It is improvisation armed with confidence. Iran, moreover, is a state that has built its own strategic culture around patience. It absorbs blows, studies responses, and looks for asymmetries. The American habit of thinking in news cycles and deployment windows collides here with a regime accustomed to thinking in decades. To apply force without a clearly articulated political objective is to invite a contest of endurance in which the United States has historically proven restless. The discipline of strategy also requires an honest accounting of trade-offs. Resources committed to one theater are resources unavailable elsewhere. Attention lavished on one adversary dulls perception of others. A republic that treats military action as a substitute for policy eventually finds itself with many actions and no policy at all. Restraint, in this sense, is not weakness but judgment. It is the recognition that power achieves its purposes only when governed by ends that are limited, intelligible, and publicly defended. The decision to use force against Iran would not merely test American weapons. It would test whether the United States still remembers how to choose, rather than simply how to act. Law is the Republic's way of insisting that power explain itself. It is not an ornament applied after decisions are made, but a discipline meant to shape them before force is loosed. In questions of war, legality and legitimacy are not abstractions for scholars. They are practical constraints that determine whether power persuades or merely coerces. A nation that treats law as a technicality soon discovers that legitimacy, once spent, is difficult to replenish. Internationally, the United States operates within a framework it helped construct after 1945, one that rests on the presumption that force is lawful only in self-defense or with collective authorization. To claim otherwise is to invite other states to improvise their own exceptions. Iran, like all states, understands this grammar of legitimacy. It exploits ambiguity, appeals to grievance, and presents itself as the aggrieved party when struck. When American action lacks a clear legal rationale, Tehran's narrative gains traction not because it is virtuous, but because it is convenient for others who resent American power. Domestically, the burden of justification is heavier still. The Constitution does not ask whether a military action is popular or efficient. It asks whether it is authorized. Congressional silence is not consent, and executive assertion is not deliberation. Yet modern practice has blurred this distinction until legality becomes a matter of interpretation rather than decision. The people's representatives are invited to react rather than choose, and responsibility dissolves into process. Legitimacy also has a moral dimension. A republic that claims to act in defense of order must demonstrate fidelity to its own rules. When the United States insists that others respect borders, treaties, and norms, it is appealing to a standard that restrains itself as much as it restrains others. To erode that standard for the sake of expedience is to trade long-term authority for short-term freedom of action. The use of force against Iran, therefore, would demand more than a briefing and a press statement. It would require a public reckoning with law, purpose, and consequence. That reckoning is uncomfortable, which is precisely why it is indispensable. Law does not prevent error, but it makes error harder to commit casually. The choice before the Republic is not, as it is often framed, between action and inaction. That is the rhetoric of impatience, a false dichotomy that flatters urgency and demeans judgment. The real choice is between government by impulse and government by deliberation, between treating power as an instrument of will and treating it as a trust bounded by purpose and restraint. Republics do not perish because they hesitate too long. They erode because they act too easily. In considering Iran, the United States confronts a mirror held up by history. Every prior entanglement in the region began with confidence and control and ended with an education in limits. The lesson is not that America should withdraw from the world, but that it should re-enter its own constitutional discipline. Decisions of war and peace were never meant to be managerial adjustments, delegated to executives and sanitized by euphemism. They were meant to be moments of national seriousness, in which the costs are named before they are paid and the purposes defined before lives are risked. There is also a quieter choice at work, one less discussed but more consequential. It is the choice between a politics that prizes seriousness and one that rewards performance. Military options become props in a theater of resolve, signals sent less to adversaries than to domestic audiences. Yet adversaries read these signals differently, and history reads them most unforgivingly of all. A republic that confuses signaling with strategy eventually loses credibility, not because it failed to act, but because it failed to explain why it acted. Self-government is a demanding inheritance. It requires patience with process, tolerance for disagreement, and respect for limits that frustrate ambition. These are not weaknesses. They are the architecture of liberty. When Americans ask what involvement in Iran would mean, they are really asking whether the nation still believes that power should be constrained by law, choice by consequence, and action by memory. The future will not be kind to nations that forget why they were designed to slow themselves down. The question, then, is not what Iran will do next, but what the United States will remember about itself.